First and most important question. Why should people ask questions?
When you're asking questions and listening, it's my belief that that's when you have most control over what goes on, because you can control the conversation, just to get the information you want or to build the relationship. You can influence through questions, as everybody knows, right? You can ask questions that just get other people speaking and collaborating, or you can ask questions just to defend yourself, stay in a safe place. So it's really a bit about control, really.
People have a lot to say, but not a whole lot to ask. So maybe how can people understand even deeper what you just said right now?
Your first observation, I think you're exactly right. And funnily enough, I woke up this morning with that observation. If you think about social media, which is pretty important these days, people don't ask very much on social media, on LinkedIn and so on. They've got a lot to say, but they don't, you don't have a lot to ask. So perhaps one of the things people are most interested in is how to influence other people, right? And so one of the key ways of influencing is using reframes, reframing questions.
Especially like what you said there, because I'm very tempted to say whatever I think I want to say when someone asks me to tell about myself. But just pausing to ask them what they want to know, I think you get to start off on the right foot.
Yeah.
And to your point, you have control over the situation. Can you elaborate on control over the situation or the conversation?
If you're telling things, well, my personal experience, because I do a lot of training, we do training together. And don't you feel sometimes when you're telling people about stuff, there's some theory, some model you're explaining, and you're there talking away, and in front of you on the screen, there are 15 boxes, half of them without the camera on, and you've no idea what people are doing. You've no idea if they're listening, if they're doing their email or whatever. You've got no control whatsoever. If you ask one or two people to say something, to explain themselves and so on, then you start to understand if they're listening, if they're learning, and that's what I mean by control. And you need that level of control. It's not about manipulating other people. It's a question of having enough control so that the conversation goes in the right direction. Does that answer your question?
That does. And I think it opens up even more questions, which is if you're a manager versus an individual contributor, you can use this, sounds like, to bring things in your control and actually drive the conversation in a more productive way. So before we get further on that, I really want us to understand the next thing, which is the what. What are the details? And the first question I have is, I keep finding out there are many types of questions. So can you educate us on the many types of questions?
There are many types of questions. I agree with you. It's quite important because when you ask questions, especially if you're trying to bring the conversation under control a bit, you do need to be aware of the types of questions you can ask and the purpose of your question. So if it's a simple situation, you're just investigating something, for example, so you just need facts, you can ask straightforward open or closed questions. You can ask a curiosity question, could you just tell me a bit more about that? That sounds interesting. Once you start to get information, you can ask about the importance of different types of information. What are people's priorities? If they've told you about 5 different problems that concern them, you can try and find out what the most important ones. You've asked people to explain things. Quite often you need to ask clarification questions. So all of those things are pretty straightforward. We do them all the time. It's just quite nice to be aware, because if you're aware for a start, you're liable to be speaking in a more interesting way. If you're investigating, if you're trying to find out something from somebody and you're monotonous in the type of questions you ask, the other person's going to feel like they're being interrogated, right? It's going to feel like it's Spanish Inquisition. And so a bit of variety helps. If you're relationship building, if you're asking questions because you're trying to just get to know the other person, then you ask more gentle questions, what I call umbrella questions that kind of cover such a large scope that the person can answer any way they want, so you put them in a nice, comfortable position with a question like that. Or you can ask them their opinion, right?
Mm-hmm.
People love telling you their opinions. So if you ask somebody in France at the moment what you think of Mr. Macron, you're going to get a reply.
No one's going to hold back on that. So I hear a few things where there's important question, clarification, umbrella, opinion. And I'm more familiar with the closed and open question. And I find it fascinating how we don't pay attention to the type of question we're asking. For example, would you be able to show up on time? Seems to be like a closed question, a simple yes or no. And if it's not a favorable answer, I've kind of closed my option. Versus an open question would be very different. Can you walk us through the differences of the types of questions and how to use one versus the other with an example, if you don't mind?
Whoa, I do my best. Well, one thing is be careful, because sometimes you may have a question mark at the end of the sentence, but it's not really a question. Like the example you gave,
Right.
Would you like to turn up on time is not really a question. At the best, it's a rhetorical question.
Right.
Which ones do you think I need to clarify most, Suraj? I mean, curiosity, umbrella. Umbrella is an unusual word.
Right. I think let us start with the closed versus open. I think there's a lot of advantage for people like me and people on the call to learn the difference and know why pick one over the other. So let's start with open versus closed.
Yeah, okay. So closed versus open. I mean, a closed question is one where the answer is either yes or no, or a number, or an address, or something like that. Finished. An open question leaves the other person with much more choice about how they answer the question, basically. Both are good depending on the circumstances. If you want to close a subject, if you want to get to a conclusion, are you going to buy this or not? That's a closed question, and that's what you need to answer. If you don't want to intimidate your potential customer, you'll ask, what do you think of the product? Have you got a project coming up where it might be relevant? Give them space. So that's that's open closed. Yeah.
I see. It would help me, Andy, if you were able to provide examples of closed questions, maybe a handful.
So at what time do we start the podcast? How many people are on the podcast? When's your birthday? Something like that. They're all closed questions. Zaha?
I think that when you need to make a quick, impactful decision, and by impactful, I think simple decision, like you said, when is it going to start? Who's going to come? Then you use closed questions. But anytime that you want to get information from someone, you want to understand where they're coming from, you want to influence them in any way, you would want to use open-ended questions, because that will get the other person talking a little bit more, and it will give you a better understanding of where their mind's at. So
I agree. Yeah, because closed questions are fairly rare.
I would agree. Most times I would lean towards the open-ended questions.
Yeah.
To both of you, what are some good examples of open-ended questions? If you have observed people...
Well, that was one. Okay. Well, I'll give you an example. I was in Belgium last week, and I went into this guy's office, and he had two massive pictures up on the wall, one of a panda, one of an elephant. They were amazing. So I said, wow, I love the pictures. Where did they come from? Where'd you get them? Okay. And you get this big story, both the panda and the elephant had attacked him, actually. It was quite an interesting story, but he just loved telling the story. Now, I had no idea he was going to tell me these stories. I thought, perhaps a National Geographic or something. Whereas in fact, one of them was he took by his daughter, and the other one of the elephant he took himself, which was why the elephant decided to attack him. So, that's just an open question. Where did you get them from?
My favorite umbrella questions are, tell me more about, what do you think, and how do you feel about?
Yeah.
Those are very open-ended. You can't answer.
Yeah. Can you elaborate more on what are some of the intentions that you would consider and then ask questions?
I think it's important to be aware of your intention. I mean, it's not too complicated. I think the best intentions when you ask are you're trying to move things forward, in the sense you're trying to help the other person understand something better, or you're trying to influence them in the direction you want things to go. When I'm coaching, I think this applies to managing as well, I always try and have the intention of helping the other person, because in general you're collaborating with them. As far as intention is concerned, I think it's quite important to pay attention to what you shouldn't have as an intention, which is showing off, for example. When you're in large audiences, you quite often get people asking questions just to show how much they know, right? And we all fall into that, right? We're in a meeting, you've got the boss at the end of the table. I'm going to show, this is my question. Whoa.
Right.
But people recognize your intention.
And I think intentions match very well with the types of questions that we talked about.
Yes.
So are you curious? Are you trying to make the person feel safe? Are you looking for data? So I think paying attention to what our intentions are and then matching it with the questions is very advantageous.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, there's an alignment there between the purpose of the question and what you intend, and the two things should be aligned. Yeah.
Intentional or unintentional, and that's what it is. I think we have a very good question that will add more value to what we're discussing. We do have one, which is how to handle open-ended questions in an interview, or how not to ask open-ended questions as an interviewer. This is by one of the attendees.
Well, as an interviewer, I think you probably want to mix open-ended questions in the way that we've been describing. And sometimes you qualified, to do X or not, and you ask a closed question. Have you got that degree? Have you got that qualification? And you ask the closed question. Other times you just want to, tell me about the work you did at Texas Instruments, and you just say something and then you home in on a particular subject.
I see.
So the open-ended question, and then how do you handle it as an interviewee? Well, how you handle it as an interviewee, I think, is, well, if you're comfortable and you've got a story and it's nice and concise, just go with it. If you're uncomfortable, try the defensive mechanisms that I was mentioning earlier on. Yeah.
I think that's a very good perspective, where someone might be trying to make you feel comfortable. And if I'm self-assured and I don't need that level of comforting, I could answer the question very swiftly, say what's in the resume, and be like, hey, thank you for making me feel comfortable. Now, do you want to know any further details?
Yeah.
And that's asking a question and taking control back and making them know that, hey, you can ask me more details. I don't need to be babysat or something like that. So that's one way of using questions to take control back of the situation. Would that be fair?
Yeah. I certainly think it's this business of using questions for control works on both sides of the table. And again, the word control, I don't want to use in a brutal way. It's not control in the sense of, controlling the other person and making them do things they might not want. It's more a question of just getting things to go a bit more in the direction you want them to.
Knowing you, Andy, the word you normally use is guide. You like to guide people. This is just guiding people.
Right, just guiding things. Just nudging them along in the right direction. Yes.
Jatinder Singh, JP, and his question is, would you take a minute or two on how you build trust with questions, especially for folks who do not wish to be seen as vulnerable, maybe insecure or afraid to be seen as such? Thanks in advance, JP Singh.
You need to start, when people are feeling vulnerable, you need to start with questions they'll find easy to answer, and then listen very carefully. And it depends how the conversations goes, a bit like the discussion we just had about interviewing. You may continue to be in that mode. You may be with, say, a collaborator who is extremely vulnerable, and you've got to be very, very careful for the whole of the conversation not to upset them, in which case you're going to have to gentle. But otherwise, if you're listening carefully, you might feel that they're beginning to trust you and gaining confidence, in which case you can then adjust the purpose according to the way things are going.
I think to add to Andy's point, when you're trying to build trust with someone, you need to start building rapport. And a quick way to build rapport with someone is to match their energy, match their tone of voice, match their body posture. So once you've matched them and you've started building rapport, and like Andy said, you're asking the gentle questions, you can slowly start pulling them out, and you'll find that they start to open up a little bit more. I think a lot of times people who are shy or who are reserved, if you go up to them and you have all this energy, it will shut them down.
Yeah.
Match their energy to bring them out.
Yeah, you make a very, very good point, because there's different types of vulnerability, and if you're typically talking with engineers, they can be very vulnerable, and you know it, but nevertheless they don't like to be treated too gently. They like snappy questions, factual questions, and so on. That's the way they behave, and therefore, as Zaha points out, you've got to match that, because they'll trust you if you do that, and they won't trust you if you treat them in a very tree huggy kind of way. So
what I'm hearing is, if someone wants to be helped, you can help them, and if someone does not want help, you can't do anything about it, right?
I think you have to meet people where they're at.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah,
You have to, whether they're very high energy or low energy. It works in every social situation. Match the energy first, and then pull them up or pull them down wherever you take them. But I think it's so important to read the room, understand, have an intention of building rapport with someone. Come off too strong, especially with somebody who is already reserved. So match the energy and match the tone and the body.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And you know what? It's often a question of not doing things rather than doing them, because if you are relaxed and you haven't got this long list of questions you're going to bombard somebody with, but you're going into a normal conversation, you will tend to match the other person. It's a natural thing. We do it naturally.
I somehow feel that's an advice from me at this very moment. Next, we have a question from Mahati. Thank you, Mahati, for joining us. And her question is, what resonates with Mahati is the situational questioning, where one could flare and focus between open versus closed questions. Like Zaha and Andy said, for big creative thinking and getting more information, we would flare and ask open ones. But then for the quick decision making, one would ask closed ones.
Once, because it's a terrible habit that I've certainly got, and I've seen all over the place, where you try to ask a question and you're not really quite happy with the way you express yourself. And so before anybody's replied, you try and reformulate it and you explain it a bit more clearly. And that's not quite right. So you just say a couple of other things to clarify. And by the time you finish with your 3 different versions of the question, the other person's totally confused and off the hook. and it's much, much better, even if you didn't get your question right the first time, just to stop and see what the other person makes of it and what they say. Listen, and then you'll see if they've understood, and you'll also see if they can express themselves a bit more clearly than you could. But reformulating before you've been asked to, it is a terrible habit that I find myself doing, and I see quite a lot. Once I became aware of it, I saw it quite a lot.
I have to agree. And especially when you ask the question and the person misunderstands, or you think they misunderstood and respond, I'm aching to correct them. I'm like, no, that's not what I asked.
Yeah.
But that self-awareness is so important. How did you figure that out, Andy, to teach yourself to pause? And it's okay to let go.
How did I figure it out? Well, it's very gradual. I think gradually, as you start to talk about these subjects and put words on what you're doing, so you start to classify the types of questions you ask, and so on. And so you start to structure the subject, and gradually that awareness gradually builds up, and you become a little better at observing yourself and other people in action. And then I noticed, I guess it came out of the desire to make the questions short and get the other person to speak. And I found myself saying much too much before I let the other person speak.
How do you go about getting information from reluctant sources? How do you use follow-up questions? Describe what is playback and how to use it. How do you study someone's body language and then prime your questions? And lastly, how do you align your body language when asking questions?
Yeah.
So I'd like to actually hear both your opinions about it. So maybe, Andy, you go first and then Zaha as well.
Some of these things I find much easier to answer when you've got a concrete example, because how do you get underneath, how do you get to the underlying issues? It's a bit like saying, how do you debug software? I mean, it depends. It depends a great deal on the individual issue. I think my first instinct is you've got to give yourself time. So if, as I was mentioning earlier, you come into a conversation and you've got this idea of how many questions you want to ask, or if you're not listening very well, and instead of hearing what the other person's saying, you're thinking of your next question, then you're very unlikely to get to the underlying issues. If you want to get to the underlying issues, you've got to watch them, you've got to listen, and then you've got to take the time to work out what you're going to say next. And that may require a bit of silence, and that silence actually should add to the power of whatever you say next, to the power of the question. The quality of your question is going to depend on your listening and your thinking.
Sounds like an Icon 9 tool map.
Kind of,
right.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah. What about reluctant sources then? That's interesting, isn't it? Zaha, have you got any thoughts on that?
So I think what I have to say relates to both of them. So I'll start with a story. I was working with a customer in Brussels, and these were it was their engineering team. So we were trying to get to the bottom of things, of what their requirements were and how we could meet their needs. And these people were like this. I had to read their body language. And I could tell that they were not engaged. They weren't facing me. They were all closed. So I had to ask a lot of open-ended questions because I didn't get where their mind was at, but I could see that their mind wasn't there in the room on the problem with me. There's something else was going on in me. So as I started asking more open-ended questions like, how do you feel? Or how about your opinion about this? I sort of, made a path for myself where I asked this question and, their body language is worse. So let's go in a different direction. And then I asked in a different direction, a different technical direction. And then I understood they started leaning forward. It's like, okay, now we're on the same page. So I think that helped me get beneath the surface. There was a bit of a language issue too. So especially when there's a bit of a language barrier, I feel like reading body language is so important. Like facing you, are they facing someone else? Are they facing the exit? They just want to be out of there. Notice where people's feet are pointing. That's usually where their interest lies. So reading people's body language and their micro expressions, that's really key. So micro expressions are the very split of a second expression that somebody would make. For example, like if you meet someone and their eyebrows shoot up, that's a micro expression. They can't control that. It's truth. That means they're interested in you or they like something about you. So you're in their good books. So that's good. Same point, if you ask your customer a question, you ask your manager a question, and he makes a very slight movement in the face, so it's and then he might say the complete opposite thing, or she might say the complete opposite thing, and I'm sure we'll figure something out, So you want to read between the lines, like what so the micro expression things, you have to be, and for all of this, you have to be so in the moment. You have to be aware, and you have to be self-aware. You have to understand what your own dialogue is, and you have to read the other person and where they're at. So you have to be very aware, self-aware of your surroundings. when you're trying to read the room. So all of those things I think matter. And then the same with reluctant source, sometimes I'm the reluctant source, and I unknowingly am a little reluctant to give information. So what I do is I just fix my body language. I take up more space. Okay. And this helps even in meetings and customer situations. Just take up more space wherever you are. You seem more confident, people will want to open up to you. And if you see somebody else reluctant, like I said before, you have to match their energy first. You can match them, see where they're at, then start asking open-ended questions. And then once you find yourself a path based on the responses you get from the open-ended questions that you're asking, you'll be able to slowly have them open up.
Right. And I think, Zaha, you're demonstrating something that's important as well. It's because you've thought about all this, you got tactics, right? And you can't always use the same tactic every time. You have to really tune in and adapt your tactics. So it's good, everybody, that you came to the podcast, because it's only by practicing and talking about these things and putting words on the concepts that you gradually build up your repertoire of tactics.
Like, I may have all the tactics and all the repertoire, but I'm not always going to be a good listener. I can't bring my A game every time. So you have to make an intention. And I like to, if I'm going into a meeting where it's going to be a difficult conversation, I will take 5 minutes and compose myself, do some deep breaths, get my own body chemistry in order, be mindful of what my posture is, because that's the energy that I'm bringing into the room, and that directly affects the conversation and how the person is going to respond to you. So all of that, you can't be perfect, but you have to make an intention every time you have to.
Yes, yeah. That's
I love that.
Really key point. Yeah.
So body language, take more space, practice, consistency, talking about this, and being very intentional about it. And it's okay if you don't get it right once. We don't have to bring our A game every single time. And I think that is words of wisdom that I'm going to take. I'm hoping others on the call are going to take as well. So both of you have done a marvelous job. We do have time perhaps for one more poll. I'm excited about rolling that out. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and...
So while we're waiting for the poll, another thought comes to my mind about the third, aligning your body language with asking the questions. There's something I learned from my kids' kindergarten class, and that was be a whole body listener. So like Andy's point, you can't ask the right questions if you're not listening. And I find it so useful to be a whole body listener. Like your whole body, that's what they teach the kids. Your whole body needs to
right.
And it's so powerful. Like when I am using my whole body to listen to you, I will be more attentive. I will be more in tune. So I think that really helps you guide better questions.
So just to play back that, what you mean by that is you feel something resonate inside, you're listening with your whole body, because it doesn't have to be just coming through your ears. You can actually feel what's going on.
It makes the other person feel heard. When you are based on your whole body, they will feel more heard, and they will be more responsive to you.
I guess a way how not to do it is, Zaha, you were saying something. What was that? Body language. Right. And I think that is so true, like, especially with kids and with anybody. If I'm looking at the camera and saying that what you said made a good impact on me versus me just looking at my image or yours, makes a huge difference. So it's much more helpful if I even just look directly at the camera, even though it's, a sensor there, a video sensor. It makes a huge difference for the recipient.
That's a very good point. Yeah. And because we do so much by...
How do you know when you have asked enough questions? You're interviewing for a new job opportunity. What's your favorite question to ask in an interview? That is tied for first place. So we have 9 votes so far. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sure we can, in an email, answer the others as well. But if we can just give a rapid fire, like a minute each. Andy, you 1 minute. Zaha, 1 minute for the first question, and then again a minute each for the second question.
Show us the poll.
Yeah, go ahead.
We asked enough questions. Well, we've got another 4 minutes and 43 seconds, so I'm going to know when the time runs out.
Okay. So go ahead and give your 1 minute response for that, and then Zaha another 1 minute.
But more seriously, it's when the energy, it's exactly what Zaha's been talking about very eloquently. It's, you can tell when somebody's, if you're watching, when the energy goes out of their face, you've asked enough questions. Yeah.
Okay. Zaha?
I think it's when you feel the rapport is built and you make progress. And whatever your intention was for progress, whether it's to gain more information, like in your mind, okay, we have moved forward with what our intended goal was here. So you've met your goal, and like what Andy says, their energy is out, or they started facing the exit. That's body language for them.
Okay. Or we are both facing the same direction and we're ready to rock and roll, execute, right? So then we're ready to go. Okay. You're interviewing for a new job or opportunity. What's your favorite question to ask an interviewer?
Oh, you're trying to get the job.
Yeah.
Okay. I took it the other way around. But if I was interviewing, I'd ask, for examples. I always get something concrete. If you're asking for a job, I'll pass. I haven't done my homework on this one.
Zaha?
I think a powerful question to ask is whatever the position is, and like, how would I phrase it? Like, how would you describe someone who is successful in this position? So that gives you a criteria of, what you need to do to check off all the boxes to be a top performer in this role. So.
Got it. I have an additional spin to that, which is I heard on the internet, must be true, of course, right? Ask the same question, but position yourself. Hey, Mr. or Miss Interviewer, if you see me 3 months from now succeeding, what do you think I'm doing in order to succeed? So you're planting that vision in their mind. And that's how I would add that. All right. What can our audience do today, 3 months from now, or 1 year from now, in order to develop the art of asking questions? What can they do? What advice do you have for them in closing? And Zaha, you as well.
I would suggest really experiment, and this, you could almost look at this podcast as a beginning in that. You need to experiment. Deliberate practice is the way to do it, so that you build up your model kind of what a good question is, you build up your awareness and so on. And to make that more effective, if you like that sort of thing, you can keep a journal, you can keep a record of what worked and what didn't work. I'm not very good at keeping journals, so I tend to either talk to somebody or recently I learned that these guys are very helpful. I talked to my rubber duck, right? And just by getting it out there and saying something, it tends to get new ideas to embed a bit better. But deliberate practice is the key. It's all about doing it.
Zaha, closing comments?
So I absolutely, practice is key. And there's two things that I recommend practicing. The first is to practice setting an intention for every communication you have. Every communication. And that will help you start building awareness of your own thoughts, what's going on in your brain and others. Like, okay, my intention when I'm talking to my kid is to make them, what is your intention when you're talking to people? That will start building a lot of awareness in you. And then if you really struggle with asking good questions and getting to the bottom of things, I've been there. And I think what helped me the most is to build some sort of mindfulness practice where you practice to quieten your mind and slow down so that, and this is something you need to do over time. Like, you're not going to have like a mindfulness practice and you're going to be good in a week. This is the thing that's long-term. Like, you would slow down your mind for 10 minutes a day, and over time you will be a better listener because you've learned to quieten your mind and actually listen to other people, and that will lead you to ask better questions.
Yeah, can I just chain on to that, because I completely agree with you, and the kind of result of that in the end is you throw away your ego. Because when you're asking questions, you're giving the other person the opportunity to find the solution for whatever it is, you're guiding them maybe, because that means that they're going to come up with the answer. And so to be able to do that, to slow down, you've kind of got to just let the other person take some space. And that, is something that takes a little while and comes from things like meditation practice. And it doesn't mean you're any less effective. It doesn't mean you don't have to abandon your goals or anything like that. It's just you kind of do it a bit more subtly and in a more relaxed way.
Wonderful. I thought I had a good time talking to you guys, and the 1 hour just flew by. Very grateful for both of your guys' advice, constant support. So thank you, Andy. Thank you, Zaha, for participating here, educating me, educating our audience. And thank you all for joining as well. And with that, I think we have a close end to today's call. There is a survey that goes out to everyone who joined us. So it takes probably like 5 to 6 seconds to take the survey. Tell us what we can do better, what you like, what you didn't like, and any other future topics that you'd like to listen to. Anything else, Andy and Zaha?
Thanks, Suraj. Thank you very much for the organization. You did it beautifully.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's a great deal. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Alrighty.
All right. Thank you.
Sure, guys. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.